The worst thing that ever happened to me started with a man laughing at his phone 2 desks away. That's where it began. Not with a scandal, not with a lie, not with the scene on a sidewalk that I still see in my head when I close my eyes at night. It began with a laugh. A small, ordinary, afternoon laugh from a man I barely knew, in an office I'd been working at for about 6 weeks, in a city I'd moved to specifically because I was done letting men wreck my life. My name is Stephanie. I was 24. I'd just taken a job in Austin after 8 months of telling myself I was finally getting it together. I'd left Dallas the way people leave places they're ashamed of, quietly, with a U-Haul and a list of things I was never going to do again. New apartment, new job, new version of me. The plan, if you could even call it that, was simple. Keep my head down. Make my deposit into savings every other Friday. Stop mistaking attention for affection. Romance wasn't just off the table. Romance wasn't even in the building. And then Jason leaned back in his chair. I want you to understand something about him before I go any further, because the whole story depends on it. Jason didn't look dangerous. Dangerous men look dangerous. Jason looked like the kind of guy who'd help you jumpstart your car in a parking lot and wave off the 20 you tried to hand him afterward. He sat 2 desks over in our open floor plan, one arm slung behind his head like life had never once surprised him, and he had this laugh, this low, easy, private laugh at whatever he was watching on his phone in the slow part of the afternoon. I'd glance up from my monitor, catch the back of his neck and think, that's a man who's never been blindsided by anything in his life. That was the first thing I got wrong about Jason. It wouldn't be the last. And I wasn't looking. I need that on the record, because later, when everything fell apart, I spent a lot of nights trying to figure out where exactly I'd stepped off the path, and the honest answer is that I didn't step. I drifted. Proximity is the most underrated force in human life. Sit near someone 5 days a week, and you start collecting details you never asked for. He brought his own coffee in a thermos, instead of drinking the office stuff. He said good morning to the receptionist and the cleaning crew, in the exact same voice he used for the VPs. He held doors and actually waited, even when you were still 20 feet away, even when it made him late for his own meeting. I noticed these things the way you notice weather. Not because I was paying attention, but because they were just there, climbing into the back of my brain and moving the furniture around without asking me first. The first time we really talked, I was heating up leftover pasta in the break room. He walked in, looked at my Tupperware and said, "That smells like 1,000 times more effort than the sandwich in my bag." I laughed. He stuck out his hand, told me his name, and walked back to his desk. And when I got back to mine, I caught myself smiling at nothing. And that smile bothered me. I didn't know why yet, but some part of me did. Some part of me was already sitting up straight, tapping on the glass, trying to get my attention. I ignored it. Here's what I can promise you, because I've had years to sit with this story and turn it over in my hands like a rock I can't throw away. What I'm about to tell you is not a story about a bad man and a naive woman. It's not a story about one mistake. It's a story about how the worst thing you ever did doesn't stay buried just because you stopped digging. It waits. It waits 4 years. It waits through a new city and a new job and a new person and a whole new version of yourself that you built on top of the old one, like a floor over a basement you swore you'd never go back down into. And then, on an ordinary Sunday morning in October, in a living room where you're finally supposed to feel safe, it looks up at you from a couch, and it smiles, and it says your name like it's been practicing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the break room. Let me tell you about Jason. Before I tell you what Jason did to me, I have to tell you what Dallas did to me, because one is the reason the other worked. I don't want to turn this into a pity tour, so I'll keep it short. Dallas was 3 years of the kind of relationships you don't brag about at Thanksgiving. Men who were charming until they weren't. Men who borrowed money and forgot to pay it back. One who told me he loved me on a Tuesday and moved a different woman into his apartment the following Monday. I wasn't a victim in any dramatic way. I was just a girl who kept picking the wrong door in the same hallway over and over, and then acting surprised when the room behind it was empty. By the time I was 23, I'd stopped trusting my own taste in people. That's a hard thing to admit about yourself. It's harder to live with. The Austin job came at the exact right time. A recruiter found me on LinkedIn, made a cold call on a Wednesday afternoon while I was eating cereal over my kitchen sink, and by the end of the month I'd signed a lease on an apartment I hadn't seen in person and loaded everything I owned into the back of a U-Haul that smelled like somebody else's cigarettes. I drove the 3.5 hours down I-35 telling myself out loud, like a prayer, that I was going to be different now. I was going to be quiet. I was going to be careful. I was going to be the kind of woman who didn't need a man to feel like she was standing on solid ground. And for 8 months, I pulled it off. I really did. I ate dinner alone. I watched reality TV I didn't care about. I went to the grocery store on Saturday mornings and the laundromat on Sunday afternoons, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like nothing in my life was about to catch fire. Then I met Jason, and the fire caught anyway, and I couldn't even smell the smoke. The lunches were how he got me. Not flowers, not compliments, not some grand gesture you'd see in a movie. Lunches. After that first conversation in the break room, the one about the pasta, the little interactions started stacking up in a way that didn't feel like a pattern until the pattern was already built. He'd time his coffee refills to mine. He'd drift over to my desk to ask me a question he absolutely could have put in an email. He'd catch my eye across a conference room table during a team meeting and raise an eyebrow at whatever corporate nonsense we were all pretending to care about, and I'd have to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. Small things. Harmless things. Things that added up to someone paying attention to me. And I was so starved for that particular kind of attention that I didn't stop to ask myself why he had so much of it to give away. The first time he asked me to grab lunch outside the office, I said yes before my brain had a chance to remember the vow I'd made on I-35. We walked 2 blocks to a taco place with plastic tables in the sun and fluorescent orange chairs that had been faded by a decade of afternoons. He ordered too much food. He asked me about my family. Not the lazy version of that question, the one where someone's just waiting for their turn to talk, but the real version, where the follow-ups keep coming, where he actually remembered that I'd said my mom was a nurse and wanted to know what kind, at which hospital, for how long. He asked me about the music I listened to and the books on my nightstand, and whether I'd been to this other taco place around the corner that was supposedly better. He asked me what I'd done in Dallas. I gave him the edited version, the one where I'd just wanted a change of scenery. And he nodded like he understood without needing me to say more. And something about that nod made me want to tell him the unedited version too. I didn't. But I wanted to. That was new for me. And while we were sitting there, I did the thing I'd promised myself I'd do with any man I ever noticed again. I looked at his hands. Both of them. I was sneaky about it, the way you'd check for a weapon. Left hand, empty. Right hand empty. No ring. No pale band where a ring might have lived. No little divot in the skin from a ring freshly removed. His fingers were clean, and his knuckles were tan, and there was a small nick on one thumb from where he'd apparently sliced himself opening a box at some point that week. I remember the wave of relief that went through me, and I remember being furious at myself for feeling it, because relief meant I cared, and caring meant the wall I'd been building for 8 months already had a crack in it. After that lunch, the whole thing just accelerated. We started eating together almost every day, sometimes with other people from the office, so it looked like a group thing. But even in a group, there was this invisible wire strung between the two of us, and I could feel it hum whenever he glanced at me. His knee would find mine under the table and neither of us would move away. He'd reach across to steal a chip from my plate and his fingers would brush my wrist and stay a half second too long. A joke would land, and I'd laugh and look up and find him already looking at me, with this expression like he was trying to memorize my face for later. It was the kind of attention I'd been dying of thirst for, and I drank it in gulps without stopping to check what was in the cup. He kissed me for the first time in the parking garage on a Thursday night, and I still remember the exact slope of the concrete ramp and the sound of somebody's car alarm going off 2 levels up. We'd stayed late at the office, not because either of us had work to do, but because we were both stalling, both pretending we had one more email to answer, both waiting for an excuse to walk out together. He offered to walk me to my car. I let him. When I turned to say goodnight, he was closer than I'd expected, and then closer still. And then he was leaning in so slowly that I had about 3 full seconds to step back if I wanted to. I didn't step back. His mouth tasted like the afternoon coffee he'd been drinking since 2, and when he pulled away, he looked at me with this soft, pleased, exhausted relief, like a man who'd finally been allowed to do something he'd been rehearsing for weeks, which, looking back, is exactly what he was. After that night, we were together. Not officially, not in any conversation we ever had out loud, but in every way that actually mattered. He texted me first thing in the morning. He learned how I took my coffee and started bringing me one every day without being asked. On the weekends, we'd drive around Austin in his car with the windows down, eating at places neither of us had tried, talking about the kind of nothing that only feels like nothing when you're falling in love and don't want to name it yet. He told me about growing up outside Houston. He told me about his parents, in a vague, glossed-over way I didn't think twice about at the time. He told me he wanted to open his own business someday. Something small. Something he could run on his own terms. He made me laugh the way I hadn't laughed since college. The kind of laugh that hurts your stomach and makes you put your fork down because you're afraid you'll choke. I was gone. I knew it, and I didn't fight it. I was breaking every rule I'd written for myself on that drive down I-35, and I knew that too, and I didn't fight that either. Some people walk into your life and rearrange the furniture before you even realize they've come through the door, and by the time you notice the couch is in a different place, you've already decided you like it better this way. And then came the copy machine. Her name was Danielle. She sat 3 rows behind us in the open floor plan, and I barely knew her beyond a first-name basis, the way you barely know most of the people in an office the size of ours. She was maybe 35, married, 2 kids whose photos she kept on her monitor. Quiet, polite, the kind of coworker who sent you a calendar invite instead of just walking over to your desk. I had exactly 0 reason to expect anything from her, which is part of why what happened next hit me as hard as it did. It was a Wednesday afternoon, 6 weeks into whatever Jason and I were. I'd gone to the copy machine to grab a report from my manager, and I was standing there waiting for the thing to spit out 40 pages of something I didn't even care about, when Danielle walked up next to me and pretended to need the machine too. She didn't. I could tell she didn't because she wasn't holding anything to copy. She was just standing there, and she was standing closer than 2 coworkers would normally stand at a copy machine. And when I looked up at her, she had a face on that I'll never forget for as long as I live. It was the face of a woman who had been arguing with herself in her head for days and had finally lost the argument. She said my name. Low. She asked if she could ask me something, and before I could answer, she asked if Jason and I were, a thing. I should have lied. Every instinct in my body told me to lie, to laugh it off, to say something casual about him just being a friend from work. But her face was too serious for that, and there was something in it that made me understand that lying would be a waste of both of our time. So I said yes. Kind of. Not officially. I hated how my voice sounded saying it, defensive and young, like a teenager getting caught by a parent. Danielle took a breath. I remember that breath very clearly, because it was the kind of breath you take when you're about to jump off something high. And then she looked me in the eye and she said, "Honey, you know he's married, right?" I want to describe what that felt like, but I'm not sure the English language was built for it. It was like someone had reached into my chest and flipped a switch I didn't know was there. Everything went quiet. The copy machine kept whirring, and the phones kept ringing in the background, and somebody 3 cubicles over was laughing at something on speakerphone, but all of it got muffled, like my ears had filled up with water. I said no. I said, "What?" I said, "Are you sure?" And she just nodded, small and sad, like she was sorry to be the one holding the lit match. She told me what she knew. Married almost 4 years, 2 little kids, a boy and a girl. His wife had come to the office holiday party last December, and Danielle had talked to her for 20 minutes by the punch table, and she'd seemed like a genuinely nice person. Danielle hadn't known about me until that morning, when she'd seen Jason's hand brush mine in the break room, and something about the way he'd done it had made her look twice, and then look again, and then realize she couldn't keep her mouth shut about it no matter how much she wanted to. I don't remember walking back to my desk. I must have, because the next thing I'm sure of is sitting in my chair, staring at my monitor with the report still clutched in my hand, feeling like I was underwater. I looked across the floor at Jason. He was on the phone, leaning back in that chair the way he always did, one arm behind his head, laughing at whatever the person on the other end of the line had just said. And for the first time since I'd met him, I didn't see a charming man who made me feel seen. I saw a stranger with a wife somewhere, a stranger with 2 little kids whose faces I'd never seen, a stranger who'd sat across from me at a plastic table in the sun 6 weeks earlier and asked about my family and my music and my life with a curiosity I'd mistaken for the beginning of something, when really it had just been the warm-up for a con. He'd never worn a ring. Not once. Not in 6 weeks of daily proximity. Not in the parking garage on a Thursday night. Not at lunch. Not at dinner. Not at any of the small moments where a married man might slip up and reveal the shape of the life he was hiding. He'd never taken a suspicious phone call in front of me. Never said he had to get home. Never once let the mask crack. And I was sitting there at my desk with my hand still wrapped around a stapled report I wasn't going to read, understanding for the very first time that the man I'd been falling in love with was a professional at this. And I was the amateur. I should have gotten up and walked out of that building right then. I should have gone home, changed the locks in my head, blocked his number, put in my 2 weeks in the morning, and started over again the way I'd already started over once before. I didn't owe him a confrontation. I didn't owe him an explanation. I didn't owe him 1 more minute of my life. But that's not what I did. What I did was sit at my desk for the rest of the afternoon, pretending to work, watching him across the room like I was watching a house on fire from a safe distance, and feeling the ground underneath everything I'd rebuilt in Austin start to tilt. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the wheel. I walked into my apartment, dropped my keys on the counter, sat down on my kitchen floor in my work clothes, and I cried harder than I'd cried in my entire adult life. And then, at 10 o'clock, while I was still sitting on that floor with my eyes swollen almost shut, my phone lit up on the counter above me, and Jason's name came up on the screen. I stared at it. It rang 4 times. It should have gone to voicemail on the 4th ring. I picked up on the 3rd. I picked up on the 3rd ring, and the first thing out of his mouth was my name. And the second thing was, "Are you okay? You left without saying goodbye." And the sound of his voice, the warm, familiar, slightly worried sound of it, did something to me that I still can't fully explain. It made me angrier than anything Danielle had said at the copy machine. Because that voice had been lying to me for 6 weeks, and it was still lying to me right now. And it was using the exact same tone it had used when he'd told me my laugh was his favorite sound on earth. I said, "I know." That was all I said. 2 words. I didn't fill in the rest. I wanted him to have to ask. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, and I could hear something in the background that sounded like a TV. And I could hear him calculating. And that was the worst part. That calculation. Because in that half second of quiet, I understood that Jason was not a man who was about to panic. Jason was a man who was running the script for this exact scenario, the one he'd probably been running in the back of his head every single day since we'd started whatever we were, the what if she finds out script. And now the script was live, and he was reading ahead. He said, "Can I come over?" Not "what do you mean?" Not "I'm not following." not any of the denials a guilty man might try first. He skipped straight to damage control, and I noticed that, and I filed it away in the part of my brain that was still somehow functioning, and I said okay, because I wanted to see his face when he said the things he was about to say. I wanted to know, for the rest of my life, what the face of a man looks like when he's lying to you and knows he's been caught. He was at my door in under 20 minutes. He lived closer than I'd thought, which was its own kind of information I didn't want. He came in, and I didn't hug him, and he didn't try. He sat on the edge of my couch with his elbows on his knees, and I sat in the armchair across from him, with my legs pulled up underneath me, like I was a child trying to make herself small. And I said, "Tell me." He told me a version of the truth that was designed to sound like the whole truth. He said yes, he was married. He said her name was Susan. He said they had 2 kids. He said they'd been together since college, and married almost 4 years, and it had been dying for longer than that, slowly, the way things die when nobody has the courage to call the time of death. He said they stayed together for the kids. He said the house was quiet, and the bed was cold, and there were whole weeks where they barely spoke to each other beyond logistics about daycare and groceries. He said he'd been planning to leave. He said the timing was never right. He said he hadn't meant for any of this to happen, and then he said the line that every other woman has heard before me, the line that has been told to women since the invention of the excuse. He said, "I wasn't looking for anyone either, and then you walked into my life, and everything I thought I knew about myself just fell apart." I watched him while he said it, and I want to give you the honest report. He was good. He was very, very good. His eyes got wet at the right moments. His voice cracked exactly once, on the word lose, when he said he couldn't stand the idea of losing me. His hands were open on his knees, palms up, like a man surrendering. If I hadn't spent the entire afternoon feeling something inside me go cold and hard, I might have believed him. Some part of me wanted to believe him so badly that my mouth was open before my brain had caught up, ready to say it's okay, ready to let him pull me onto the couch, ready to hand him back the 6 weeks and pretend the copy machine had never happened. I should have told him to leave. I should have stood up, walked to the door, opened it, and pointed. I should have said the sentence I'd rehearsed in my head on the drive home, the one where I told him I was worth more than being somebody's secret. But I was 24 years old. I was alone in a city where I couldn't name a single person I'd call at 2 a.m. I had spent 8 months being good and quiet and careful, and the one thing that had cracked through the quiet had been this man, and I was about to lose him in the same afternoon that I'd first understood what he really was, and my body refused. My body, which was smarter about heartbreak than my brain would ever be, just refused to do the thing I knew I was supposed to do. I let him stay. I hated myself the entire time. And that is the moment. If there's one single moment in this whole story where the ground split underneath me, that I would point to. Not the parking garage, not the copy machine, not the sidewalk later. It was me on that couch, knowing exactly what he was, and choosing him anyway. What followed was a year I still don't know how to describe without sounding pathetic, so I'm just going to tell you what it actually looked like from the inside, and you can judge me however you need to judge me. You won't be the first. The first thing that changed was the waiting. I had never understood, before Jason, what it meant to be a woman whose whole life ran on somebody else's clock. My phone stopped being my phone and became his phone. Every buzz was him or wasn't him, and which one it was determined what my afternoon felt like. I'd text him something small in the morning and watch the delivered sit there for 3 hours, 4 hours, 7 hours, and I'd invent 100 reasons in my head for why he hadn't answered yet. And the reasons would get more and more detailed the longer the silence went. And by the time he finally responded with a single word, something like hey, or busy, or miss you, I'd feel this rush of relief so strong, it almost knocked me over. And I knew, even while I was feeling it, that being grateful for crumbs is how you end up a woman who's forgotten what bread tastes like. The second thing that changed was the calendar. I don't know how to explain to someone who has never been the other woman what it feels like to watch the holidays show up on your phone one after another and know that every single one of them is going to be spent alone. Thanksgiving, he was with her family. Christmas, he was with her family. New Year's Eve, obviously, with her family. Her birthday. His mother's birthday. The kids' birthdays. School events. Parent-teacher conferences. A whole life unfolding on the other side of a wall I wasn't allowed to look over. I'd sit in my apartment on Christmas Day with my cat on my lap and a microwave dinner on the coffee table, and I'd scroll through the Instagram stories of girls I'd gone to high school with. Girls in matching pajamas with their boyfriends. Girls holding up mugs of hot chocolate. Girls whose lives looked like commercials, and I would feel a specific flavor of loneliness I hadn't known was on the menu until I ordered it by accident. The third thing that changed was me. I don't mean that in the dramatic way people mean it in country songs. I mean I stopped recognizing the woman in my bathroom mirror. I started checking his social media constantly, even though it was clean, because that cleanness itself was a clue. No photos of her, no mention of the kids, no tagged posts from family members. He had built a digital wall between his two lives so carefully that I realized, at some point in the middle of month 2, that he had been building that wall long before I'd ever come along. He had been preparing the architecture for a woman like me years before he'd met me. I was not the first. I was just the one who was stupid enough to walk into the room. I started asking questions I had no right to ask. I would ask him, "When are you going to tell her?" And he would say, "Soon." I would ask him, "What's soon?" And he would say he needed to get through the next few weeks because of something at work, or something with the kids, or a trip her mother was coming in for. There was always something. Soon was always just far enough away that I couldn't reach it, and just close enough that I couldn't quite let it go either. Soon is the drug every married man sells to the woman he's keeping on the side, and I was hooked on it. I'd take whatever dose he was willing to give me. Every few weeks I would snap. I'd call him crying, usually late at night, and tell him I couldn't do this anymore, that I was done, that I deserved better, and we both knew it. I'd say all the lines I'd been rehearsing in the shower for days. I'd feel so strong while I was saying them, like I was finally the woman I'd promised myself I would become on the drive down from Dallas. And he would listen, let me finish, let me cry it out, and then he would show up at my door 20 minutes later with that face. That specific face he saved for those moments, the one where his eyes looked broken, and his mouth was tight, and his voice got low and rough like a man barely holding it together. And I would open the door. Every single time. The only person in the world I was ever truly in a relationship with during that year was the version of me who opened that door. And I hated her. And I was her. I need to be clear about something, because I've thought about this a lot, and I want you to understand it. I don't think I stopped believing him somewhere in the middle. I think I had never really believed him in the first place. I think I had believed the feeling of being wanted, and I had believed the feeling of being pursued, and I had believed the feeling of having someone to wait for, and I had mistaken all of those feelings for belief. There's a difference between trusting a man and needing him, and by month 4 I could tell you exactly what the difference felt like, because I was living inside it. Meanwhile, my work was unraveling. I want to mention this because nobody ever talks about the collateral damage of being the other woman, how it bleeds into the hours of your day that have nothing to do with the man himself. I started showing up late. I started missing small deadlines, then bigger ones. My manager, a woman in her 50s named Karen, who had always been nice to me, pulled me into her office in the middle of what must have been month 5 and asked me if everything was okay, and I lied to her face so easily it scared me. I said I was just going through a rough patch with some family stuff. She nodded like she believed me, and I knew she didn't, and I knew she knew I knew, and we both just let the lie sit on the desk between us because neither of us had the energy for the real conversation. I started avoiding Danielle. She tried, in her own quiet way, to check on me a couple of times after the copy machine, and I'd been cold to her in a way I'm still ashamed of. I'd walk the long way to the bathroom to avoid passing her desk. I'd pretend not to hear her when she said good morning, And I knew why I was doing it. Because she was the only person in that building who had told me the truth, and looking at her reminded me that I had heard the truth and chosen to ignore it. And there is no shame in the world like the shame of being warned and refusing to listen. There was also the body stuff, and I'll just say it quickly and move on because it matters, but I don't want to dwell. I stopped eating. Not on purpose, not in some dramatic, diagnosable way. Food just stopped tasting like anything, and I'd go whole days where I'd realize at 9 at night that I'd had a coffee and a granola bar and nothing else, and I'd be too tired to do anything about it. I lost weight I didn't have to lose. My mother, who I talked to on the phone once a week and kept at arm's length about everything going on, told me during one of those calls that I sounded thin, which is the kind of thing only a mother knows how to say. I laughed and told her I was eating fine, and she said, In that way she has. And we both let it drop because I wasn't ready and she knew it. Somewhere in month 7, the cracks in Jason's story started showing up. The first one was small. He'd told me, way back at one of our early lunches, that his parents lived outside Houston. One night at my apartment, in the middle of a conversation about nothing, he mentioned his mom stopping by his house the day before, and I said, "Wait, I thought your mom lived in Houston." And his face did this tiny, almost invisible thing, a micro-flinch around the eyes, and he recovered in less than a second and said, "She drove up for the day." And I accepted it, because I wanted to accept it, but I filed it away. I was starting to file things away. The second crack was bigger. I found a receipt in his car. I hadn't been snooping, I promise. I'd just been looking for a napkin in the glove box. And there it was. A receipt from a kid's shoe store at a mall I'd never been to. Dated 3 weekends earlier. The same weekend he'd told me he'd been out of town for work. 2 pairs of kids' shoes. One small, one a little bigger. A boy's size and a girl's size. I held that receipt in my hand in the passenger seat of his car while he was inside a gas station paying for his drink, and I felt something shift. Not out of him. Out of me. Because it wasn't the lie itself that did it. It was the shoes. It was the fact that somewhere, in a city I'd never been to, there were 2 small children walking around in shoes that their father had bought them. And their father was the man who kissed me in parking garages. And those children had no idea I existed, and I had spent 7 months pretending they didn't either. I put the receipt back. I didn't say anything. But I stopped being able to look at him the same way. When he smiled at me across a table, I would see the shoes. When he touched my hair, I would see the shoes. When he told me he loved me, I would hear the cash register ring, and I would see the shoes going into a plastic bag. The third crack was Susan herself. And I need to tell you how that happened because it's the moment the whole house of cards started leaning. It was a Saturday afternoon, month 8, maybe early month 9. I was at a Target on the north side of town, picking up some basic stuff, laundry detergent, toothpaste, the usual. I was in the checkout line, half asleep, scrolling my phone, when I looked up and I saw a woman at the register 2 lanes over. She was maybe a year or 2 older than me, brown hair pulled back in a low ponytail, wearing leggings and a long sweater, and she had a little boy on her hip and a little girl standing next to her holding the edge of the cart. The little girl was asking for something, some kind of candy, and the woman was saying no in that patient, worn-down voice mothers use on the 5th no of the afternoon. And I don't know what made me look at her twice. Maybe it was the way the little boy laughed. Maybe it was intuition doing a job my brain had been avoiding. But I looked, and I kept looking, and something in the back of my skull started whispering. I didn't know her face. I'd never seen her face. Jason had been that careful. But I watched her pay for her groceries and load the kids into a cart and start walking toward the exit, and I abandoned my basket right there in line, and I followed her. I followed her through the automatic doors and out into the parking lot, far enough back that she wouldn't notice me, close enough that I could see what car she got into. It was a silver SUV, a Toyota. I knew that SUV. I had seen that SUV once, in a photo on Jason's phone. A photo I'd only caught a glimpse of when he was showing me something else and swiped too fast. I'd asked, "Whose car?" and he'd said, "My sister's," and kept scrolling. And I'd believed him because why wouldn't I have believed him? I stood in the parking lot of that Target and watched Jason's wife buckle her 2 children into the backseat of the SUV he had told me belonged to his sister, and I felt the last piece of the lie click into place like a deadbolt. She was beautiful. That was the worst part. Not in a movie way, not in an intimidating way, just in a real way. The kind of beauty a tired mother on a Saturday afternoon has when she doesn't know anybody's looking at her. She was laughing at something the little girl was saying. She looked happy. She looked like a woman who thought she knew exactly what her life was. I got back to my car and I sat in the driver's seat and I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I would cry, and I didn't. What I felt instead was this clean, terrible clarity, like somebody had wiped a fogged-up window with a rag. I had let this go on for 8 months. 8 months of a stranger's life being quietly demolished underneath her, by her husband and by me. And she had been walking around a Target on a Saturday afternoon buying juice boxes for her kids with no idea that the woman in the next lane over was one of the reasons her marriage was a lie. I drove home. I sat on my couch in the dark. I told myself out loud in the empty apartment that I was going to end it. Not with a phone call. Not at my door at 10 at night. In person. In daylight. Somewhere public. Where his face couldn't do the thing it always did. I was going to say the words, and I was going to walk away. And I was never going to open that door again. I'd like to tell you I did. I'd like to tell you that was the end of it, that the woman in the Target parking lot was my wake-up call, and I finally acted like the version of myself I'd been promising to become since the drive down I-35. But I didn't get the chance to end it on my terms, because 3 days later, on a perfect fall Tuesday with a blue sky and a cool breeze, Jason asked me to go grab a sandwich with him for lunch at a place 3 blocks from the office, and Susan was already following him. I want you to understand that I almost said no to that lunch. That detail matters to me, even now, because it's the kind of almost that haunts you for years afterward. The alternate timeline where you trusted the small voice in the back of your head that was trying to save your life. I'd made my decision 3 days earlier in the Target parking lot. I was going to end it, cleanly, on my terms, somewhere public, on a day I chose. Going to lunch with him felt like a step in the wrong direction, a cowardly little stall. One more crumb I was letting him feed me before I found the courage to push the plate away. But he'd shown up at my desk at 11:45 with that smile, the easy one, the one that used to make my stomach flip and now just made me tired. And he'd said, "Come on, just a sandwich, my treat. I barely saw you this weekend." And I'd said okay, because it was easier than not saying okay, and because some part of me thought maybe this was my chance. Maybe over a sandwich, on a park bench somewhere, in the sunlight, with people walking past, I could look him in the eye and tell him I was done. Maybe this was the moment I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. We walked out of the office together around noon. I remember exactly what I was wearing, which is a thing that happens to you on days your life splits in half. A black sleeveless blouse, dark jeans, a pair of flat tan sandals with a buckle at the ankle that I'd bought on sale the month before, and still hadn't broken in. My hair was down. I remember noticing the weather the second we stepped outside, because Austin in October can be brutal, but that day was perfect. One of those afternoons where the air is cool enough to make you roll your sleeves down and the sun is warm enough to make you squint. A nothing day. A beautiful, forgettable, nothing day. I wish to God it had stayed that way. The sandwich place was 3 blocks west of the building. We walked there side by side, not holding hands, because we never held hands anywhere a coworker might see us, but close enough that our shoulders bumped every few steps. He was talking about something. I don't remember what. Some story about one of the guys on his team, and a conference call that had gone sideways that morning. And he was laughing at his own punchline before he got to it. And I was nodding in the right places and not really listening, because my whole head was full of the sentences I was going to say to him as soon as we sat down. I was rehearsing them under my breath. I think I need to stop. I think we need to stop. I can't do this anymore. I watched your wife buy juice boxes at a Target last Saturday, and I am never going to be able to unsee her face. We picked up our sandwiches to go. I ordered something, a turkey and avocado thing, I think, but I couldn't tell you now if I ever took a bite of it. We walked back out onto the sidewalk with the paper bags in our hands, and we stood there for a second deciding where to eat. And Jason said something like, "There's a little bench in the plaza around the corner. Let's just go sit." And I said, "Okay." And I took one step to follow him, and that was when I felt it. A hand in my hair. Not on the back of my head. In it. Fingers closing around a fistful of it at the base of my skull, right where it hurts the most, and yanking backwards so hard and so fast that my whole body came with it. I made a sound I didn't know I could make. This high, broken noise that was half scream and half gasp, and the paper bag flew out of my hand and hit the sidewalk, and my sandals slipped on the concrete and I went down. I hit the ground on my right shoulder and the outside of my right hip, and the pain was immediate and electric and surprising, because you think you know what pain is until you feel the specific pain of being thrown down onto a sidewalk in broad daylight by another human being. My elbow scraped against the concrete, and I felt the skin open. My sunglasses, which had been pushed up on top of my head, flew off somewhere I couldn't track. For half a second, I thought I'd been hit by a car. My brain was scrambling for an explanation, and car was the first one it offered me, because the idea that a person was doing this to me on purpose hadn't caught up yet. Then I heard her voice, and I understood. She was screaming. Not the kind of screaming people do in movies, where it sounds rehearsed and the words come out clean. The kind of screaming a human being does when something inside them has finally cracked open after months or years of holding it shut. Her voice was raw and ugly, and it didn't sound like language at first. It just sounded like pain made audible. And then the pain resolved itself into words, and the words were about me. I tried to look up. She was standing over me, and I'd never seen her face up close. Only in a Target parking lot from 30 feet away with a little boy on her hip. And the woman standing over me on that sidewalk didn't look anything like the tired mother I'd watched buckle her kids into an SUV. This woman was a different woman. Her hair had come loose from her ponytail and was hanging in her eyes. Her face was red and wet, and her mouth was twisted into a shape mouths aren't supposed to make, and her hands were in fists, and she was leaning down over me the way you lean over something you're about to break. She called me things I'm not going to repeat. Not because I'm too delicate to say them, but because even now, all these years later, when I try to type those words out, they get stuck in my throat like a bone. Because she wasn't wrong. Every single word she used for me, I had earned. I had earned them in a parking garage on a Thursday night in April. I had earned them every time I'd opened my door at 10 at night and let him back in. I had earned them in the Target parking lot, when I'd watched her for a full minute and still gone home and not called her and not warned her, and not done a single thing to stop what I knew was going to keep happening. She wasn't screaming at a stranger. She was screaming at a woman who had watched her from a distance 3 days earlier and said nothing. And in her shoes, I would have screamed louder. She kicked me. I don't know how many times. I know it was more than once and less than 10, because at some point my body went into this animal survival mode where it stopped counting and just started protecting. I rolled onto my side and pulled my knees up and wrapped my arms around my head, and I felt her foot connect with my thigh, and then my back, and then my forearm where I was shielding my face. The kicks weren't professional. They weren't choreographed. They were the wild, unlearned kicks of a woman who had never hit anybody in her life and was making up for it all in one afternoon. Some of them barely landed. Some of them left bruises I would still see in the mirror 2 weeks later, yellow and green around the edges, tender in a way that would make me flinch when I pulled on a pair of jeans. People had stopped on the sidewalk. I want to tell you they helped. I want to tell you that someone, anyone, a stranger, a businessman in a suit, a woman with a stroller, stepped in and pulled her off me and told her to stop. Nobody did. I could see shoes out of the corner of my eye, loafers and sneakers and one pair of high heels, and above the shoes there were faces, blurred because I was crying now, and above the faces there were phones. At least 2 phones, maybe 3. I don't know if anyone ever uploaded the video. I've never looked. Some things you don't want to be able to find with a search bar. Jason was yelling her name. Susan. Susan, stop. Susan. He had his arms around her from behind at one point, trying to pull her off me, and she twisted in his grip and shoved him so hard he stumbled backwards into a parking meter. She wasn't going to be pulled off. Not by him. Especially not by him. I realized later that some of the rage in her kicks wasn't even for me. It was for him, and I was just the only body in reach. She grabbed my shirt, the black sleeveless blouse, the one I can still picture exactly. She grabbed a handful of the fabric near my collar and yanked me halfway up off the sidewalk, and my feet scrambled underneath me trying to find purchase, and she pulled my face close to hers, close enough that I could see the mascara running down her cheeks and the small silver cross on a chain around her neck, and she slapped me. I want to tell you about that slap, because it's the moment I want to make sure you understand. It wasn't a movie slap. It was a full, open-palmed, shoulder-into-it slap from a woman who had nothing left to lose, and it connected across the left side of my face with a sound I heard before I felt it. My head snapped sideways. Something bright and hot exploded behind my eye. I tasted blood immediately, sharp and metal, from where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek, and my ear started ringing with this high, thin note that would stay with me for the rest of the afternoon. And here's the thing I am going to have to live with for the rest of my life. I didn't hit her back. Not because I was above it, not because I was taking some noble high road, but because in the split second between her hand making contact with my face and my body deciding what to do next, my brain said clear as a bell, she's right. Whatever you're about to do, don't. She's right. And I went still. I went still in her hands, and I looked at her, and I let her see me. I let her see the mascara on my own face, and the blood on my lip, and the way my whole body was shaking. And for about 1 full second, we looked at each other the way 2 women can look at each other when they finally understand they are standing in the wreckage of the same man. Her eyes were full of something that wasn't even rage anymore. It was recognition. She was looking at the woman her husband had been lying to her for almost a year, and I was looking at the woman my boyfriend had been lying to me for almost a year, and neither of us had ever done anything to the other one except exist inside the same lie, and we both knew it in that second. And it was the worst second of my entire life. Then she let go of my shirt, and I dropped, and my knees hit the concrete, and she turned to Jason, and she said one sentence to him, in a voice that was so quiet after all the screaming that I could barely hear it over the ringing in my ear. She said, "I hope she was worth your children." That was it. That was the sentence. 6 words. She didn't say anything else to him after that. Not then, not on that sidewalk. She walked past him like he wasn't there. She didn't look at me again either. She just walked, straight down the sidewalk in the direction we'd come from, her ponytail half undone, and her hands shaking at her sides, and people on the street stepped aside for her like she was on fire. I was still on my knees on the concrete. The paper bag with my turkey and avocado sandwich was open next to me. The sandwich spilled halfway out. Lettuce on the sidewalk, a slice of tomato stuck to the wrapper. My elbow was bleeding. My lip was bleeding. My scalp was throbbing from where she'd grabbed my hair. And Jason was standing 3 feet away from me, frozen, his hands halfway up like a man in a movie who's just dropped a glass. And he was looking at me, and his mouth was open, and nothing was coming out of it. He said my name. I remember that. He said Steph, and he took a step toward me. I scrambled to my feet before he could reach me. My right hip screamed when I put weight on it, and I almost went back down, and one of my sandals had come off and was lying on the concrete 6 feet away, and I didn't stop to grab it. I turned, and I ran. One shoe on, one shoe off, across that sidewalk with my shoulder bleeding through my blouse and my hair in my face, and my breath coming in these short, ragged sobs I couldn't control. I ran past the people with their phones. I ran past the parking meter he'd stumbled into. I ran past the front of the sandwich place where we'd stood 2 minutes earlier picking out where to eat. I heard Jason yelling my name somewhere behind me, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see him ever again. I didn't want his face to be the last thing I saw while I was still bleeding. I ran until the pain in my hip forced me to slow to a limp, and then I limped the rest of the way to the parking garage where my car was. I don't remember the route. I don't remember crossing streets. I remember the sound of my own breathing, and the slap of my one remaining sandal on the pavement, and the ringing in my ear, which hadn't stopped. I remember that at some point I realized I was still crying, and had been the entire time. I remember riding the elevator up to the 3rd level of the garage with my forehead pressed against the metal wall, and an older man got on at the 2nd level and looked at me, saw my face, and immediately looked away. And I was grateful to him for the looking away, more than I would have been grateful to him for asking if I was okay. I got to my car. I unlocked it. I sat down in the driver's seat, closed the door, and just stopped. I didn't cry harder. I didn't scream. I didn't punch the steering wheel. I just sat there, and I stared at my own hands on the wheel, and I watched them shake, and I counted the shakes because I couldn't think of anything else to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They didn't stop. I got to about 200 before I lost track. At some point, my phone started ringing in my purse. I didn't answer. I knew who it was. It rang again. And again. It rang so many times that the sound of it became part of the ringing in my ear, and I couldn't tell which noise was which anymore. I eventually reached into my purse and pulled the phone out and turned it face down on the passenger seat without looking at the screen. I sat in that parking garage for 20 minutes. Maybe longer. Long enough that I watched a woman in a pantsuit walk past my car to her own, get in, and drive away, and then a man in scrubs do the same thing, and then an older couple holding hands, and I had this weird, stupid thought while I was watching them, which was, none of those people know what just happened to me. None of them will ever know. I'm sitting inside the worst moment of my entire life, and the rest of the world is just going home for the afternoon. When I finally turned the key in the ignition, my hand was still shaking, but I made it work. I drove home the long way, through side streets, because I couldn't face the idea of being on a main road with other cars and traffic lights, and the possibility of running into Jason's car or Susan's SUV at a stoplight. I drove home, and I parked, and I walked up to my apartment on legs that didn't feel like mine, and I unlocked my door, and I stepped inside, and I locked it behind me, and I slid down against it with my back to the wood until I was sitting on my entryway floor, with my knees pulled up to my chest. And I stayed there for a long, long time. Long enough for the light coming through my kitchen window to change from bright afternoon to that gold color it gets right before evening. Long enough for my cat to come over and sniff at my bloody elbow and then walk away, unimpressed. Long enough that when I finally stood up, my legs had cramped and I had to brace myself against the wall to get upright. I went into my bathroom. I flipped on the light. I looked at the woman in the mirror. The left side of her face was already starting to swell. There was dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Her hair was a tangled mess, and there was a raw red patch at her temple, where a clump of it had come out at the root. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder, and there was a long scrape down the outside of her arm that was crusting over. Her eye makeup was smeared halfway down her cheekbones. She looked like a woman who had just been in a fight. She looked like a woman who had deserved it, at least a little, and knew it. I looked at her for a long time. And then I said, out loud, to my own reflection, in a voice that didn't sound like mine, the first honest sentence I'd said in almost a year. I said, "We are never doing this again." And then I turned off the bathroom light, and I walked into my bedroom in the dark, and I lay down on top of the covers without taking off my clothes, and I stared at the ceiling, and I started planning how I was going to disappear. I quit my job the next morning. I didn't give notice. I called HR before the office had finished its first pot of coffee and told them there was a family emergency, and I heard my own voice come out of my mouth sounding almost normal, which scared me more than anything Susan had done the day before. I went in at lunch, when I knew Jason would be in his weekly one-on-one, and I cleaned out my desk in under 6 minutes. A mug, a cardigan, a framed picture of my cat. I dropped my badge at the front desk without looking the receptionist in the eye, and I walked out of that building on a swollen ankle, and I never saw Jason in person again. He called 31 times over the next 4 days. I counted, not on purpose. The number was just there on my screen every time I picked the phone up to do something else. Climbing, climbing, climbing. I blocked him on a Wednesday night in my bathtub with the water running so I couldn't hear the vibration on the counter. And the second I tapped the little red button, something in my chest that had been clenched for almost a year went loose, and I cried in a way that felt, for the first time, like it was draining something out instead of filling something up. Then I made a promise to myself. No more men. 15 years. I know how that number sounds. I know it sounds like a woman dramatizing her own pain to make herself feel important, but 15 was the number that came to me, and I held on to it like a rosary. 15 years of just me. Just work. Just quiet. Just rebuilding whatever was left of the girl who had driven down from Dallas 8 months before Jason had laughed at his phone 2 desks away. I found another job at a small logistics company on the south side of town. I made a couple of surface friendships with women my age who didn't ask me about my past. I got a cat. I went to therapy for a while, and then stopped, because I didn't like the woman's voice. I ate at the same restaurant near my new office 3 or 4 times a week, a little place with good soup and cheap lunch specials, and a window table where nobody ever bothered me. 3 years passed like that, slowly, quietly, in the shape of a woman rebuilding a house on top of a basement she had nailed shut. And then Marco offered me a chair. I'm going to give you the compressed version because I don't have the strength to stretch it out. He was a stranger at the restaurant with an empty seat at his table on a day the place was packed. He had dark hair and calm eyes and a patience in him that didn't feel like a tactic. He asked me everything. He listened to the answers. He asked me out. And I said no. He asked again. I said no. He asked a 3rd time, a 4th, a 5th. Never pushy, never wounded, always letting me off the hook easy, and then showing up at lunch the next day like none of it had happened. It took him almost 2 months to wear my no down into a yes, and when I finally said it, it wasn't because he'd worn me down. It was because I was tired of defending a wall against a man who wasn't even trying to knock it over. Marco was good. I need you to understand that, because everything else in what I'm about to tell you only works if you understand it. He was not a charmer. He was not a performer. He was the first man I had ever been with who didn't make me audition for his affection. He told me he loved me while we were making scrambled eggs in my kitchen on a Sunday morning. Said it the way you'd comment on the weather, and I said it back, and I meant it. And for 8 months, I let myself believe that the girl in the bathroom mirror with the bloody lip was somebody I used to know, somebody I'd left behind on a sidewalk in Austin a lifetime ago. I met his parents at month 6. Linda with her garlic and butter kitchen, Robert with his garage and his easy laugh, his sister Chloe, who was shy and sweet, and 19. I sat at their Sunday dinners, and I felt myself being stitched into something, and I let it happen. And I was so grateful I could have cried. There was one brother I hadn't met yet. Marco said he was busy, worked a lot. His wife kept him on a tight schedule. I didn't think about it. Why would I have? On a Sunday morning in October, 8 months in, Marco picked me up for lunch at his parents' house. It was one of those gold autumn days where the air smells like it wants to be remembered. He was singing along to the radio with one hand on my knee, and I was as happy as I have ever been in my entire life. And when we pulled up to the curb, He glanced at a dark blue truck parked out front and said, "Looks like my brother's here today." I said, "Oh, finally." I walked through that front door, smiling. Jason looked up from the couch. "I am going to tell you the rest of this the way it happened to me, in pieces, because my brain did not process it in order. His face, the white of it, the way his mouth opened and nothing came out. Marco pulling me forward by the hand saying, 'Hey Jay, you're finally gonna meet my girlfriend. This is Stephanie.' My knees actually buckling. Marco's confused smile, the sound of kids laughing somewhere in the back of the house. Susan walking in from the kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, and her laugh dying on her face the second she saw mine. The silence. The silence was the worst part. A silence so complete, I could hear the clock over the mantel ticking. She said, "What is she doing here?" She said, "Your girlfriend is the woman who was sleeping with your brother for a year. Ask him." She said it twice. She had to say it twice because the first time nobody in the room could make the words mean what they meant. I watched Marco's face rearrange itself in real time. I watched him turn to Jason and wait. I watched Jason look at the carpet and say, "Quiet." It was a long time ago. I want to tell you I fought. I didn't fight. I ran. I ran out that front door with one of Linda's coasters probably still sitting under the sweet tea she'd poured me 2 minutes earlier, and I ran down the sidewalk with Marco's voice getting smaller behind me, calling my name 3 times, 4, each one further away than the last, and I locked myself in a gas station bathroom 6 blocks later and sat on the floor against the wall and understood, finally, completely, that you cannot outrun the woman you used to be. She will find you. She will be sitting on a couch in your boyfriend's parents' house on a Sunday morning in October, and she will look up, and she will smile at you by name. Marco came to my apartment 3 days later. I told him everything. I mean everything. The copy machine, the parking garage, the receipt with the children's shoes, the Target parking lot, the sidewalk, the sandal I'd left behind. He listened without moving. When I was done, he said one sentence. He said, "I wish you'd told me." We tried for 2 more months. We went to dinners and held hands across tables and pretended. But there was a coldness underneath it now. A heaviness neither of us could lift. And he stopped mentioning his family. And I knew the math he was doing in his head. Me on one side. His brother, his parents, his sister, his niece and his nephew, his Sunday dinners, his whole life on the other side, and no equation where both sides balanced. He ended it in his car outside my apartment on a Tuesday night. He said he loved me first, before anything else. He said if the world were any other way, he'd spend his life proving it. He said he couldn't keep choosing me over his family, because the cost of it was tearing him apart in ways he couldn't hide anymore. I said, "I know." Because I did. I'd known since the second Jason looked up from that couch. Every day after had been borrowed time. He kissed me on the forehead, not the mouth, and I got out of his car and walked to my door and listened to his engine get smaller and smaller until it was gone. That was 4 years ago. I still live in the same apartment. I still have the same cat. I still eat at the same restaurant, at the same window table. And sometimes I look at the empty chair across from me and remember the afternoon a stranger offered me a seat, and I almost said no. Here's what I know now, and it's all I know, so I'm just going to say it plain. Losing Jason was losing a lie, and lies don't leave wounds, they leave embarrassment. I grieved the idea of him for about a week, and then what I grieved was myself. The year of myself I had thrown into a fire that was never going to warm me. Losing Marco was different. Losing Marco was losing the truth. It was losing the one man who had ever looked at me clearly and chosen me anyway. And I lost him not because of anything I did while I was with him, but because of who I had been before I ever walked into that restaurant. You can change cities. You can change jobs. You can build new walls and learn new habits and fall in love with someone kind and patient and good. You cannot outrun the girl you used to be. She is always one room behind you, waiting for the door to open. And the last thing, the thing I've never said out loud to anyone, is this. I don't wish it had never happened. I used to. I don't anymore. Because the version of me who never walked into Linda's living room on that Sunday in October is a version of me who was still lying to herself about what she had done. And I would rather be the woman sitting alone at this window table, telling you this story, than be her. At least this woman knows the truth. At least this woman isn't hiding from anything anymore. The coffee here is still good. The soup is still cheap. And the chair across from me is still empty. And I've made my peace with the fact that it might stay that way. Because some prices you pay once, and some prices you pay forever. And I am finally old enough to tell the difference. What would you do in this situation? Be honest. Or did this remind you of someone? Tell me in the comments. And if this made you think about your own relationship, I left something in the description that can help you build something stronger. Subscribe if you want more stories like this every day, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story.